The first video game I ever completed was Super Mario Land on the Game Boy, and I finished it right here. Titanic was slain in my grandparents' house in Connemara during a 90s summer afternoon I probably should have been spending outside. Since they passed away, my grandparents' house has sadly fallen into disrepair. Even the oven, which is the old kind built to survive a nuclear war, has warped. And standing somewhere you spent so much of your childhood and seeing it fall apart around you, well, it's hard not to feel melancholy. I mean, there's mold on the clock. Analogies don't get much more on the nose than that, do they? And I used to listen to that clock a lot because my grandparents spoke Irish and I didn't. So there weren't that many conversations around me I could engage in. And that's a shame because it turned out they were quite interesting people. In fact, they were often invited to be on the radio just to chat and tell stories. My grandfather even appeared on TV where he talked about Brendan Behan, free beef, making coffins, cursing the shoes of nuns, and performed the first foot measuring broadcast on Irish television. But despite cursing the shoes of nuns, he was pretty lucky. The street he lived on while working in England was flattened by a bombing run during World War II, only shortly after he returned home to Connemara. Once back, he bought a field for £40, where he built this house himself. I only knew him as an old man who sat, smoked, and played solitaire. I was amazed to hear that he'd been in a play that was being performed in Dublin. The entire troupe even met Mayor Alfie Byrne, but I think in those days it was quite difficult to avoid meeting Alfie Byrne. My grandmother spent time in England too, working in the kitchens for Lord and Lady Aberdare, who she never actually saw beyond glimpses through the basement windows. The staff were ruled by a butler with an iron fist, which would presumably heat up a lot while serving tea. But she did learn a lot about good cooking from the chef whenever he wasn't chasing girls. And thanks to the sewing skills she honed there, she was able to make dresses for her daughters later in life. And her brother worked as a gillie for the Ismays, who were hiding out in the west of Ireland due to some bad publicity, just because a big boat didn't make it all the way from one place to another. The tabloid press, I mean, you'd swear nobody ever made a mistake. And I hear they're even going to make a film about it. All this stuff I knew nothing about. All I knew was the nearby coral beach was not ideal for barefoot walks or making sandcastles. But it was perfect for practicing lying on a bed of nails or making little piles of rubble. There's not actually much to do at a coral beach other than to stand there and appreciate it. And appreciating is the last thing any child wants to do, especially when Titanic still has Princess Daisy. Today, that coral beach is exactly the same. In fact, everywhere I look, it's the same as in the old home movies, aside from the odd wind farm. Also on those old tapes, a City Imp bus, the Ferrero Rocher advert, and lots of my dad saying, "Put the camera away." He simply couldn't appreciate that I was a content creation pioneer. Anyway, the fact that the area has stayed the same for so long compounds the guilt I feel for not being fluent in Irish. My grandparents and their parents, go back as far as you like, they all spoke Irish. And I broke the chain. I blew it. All those years of Irish classes and nothing but a cúpla focal to show for it. But in fairness, it was the same for everyone around me, despite Zig and Zag's best efforts. Earthworm Jim was in English, and Heidi was Oscailga. There was no fighting the tide. These are the same anxieties Seamus Heaney wrote about in Digging. So, yeah, I'm very like the poet Seamus Heaney in a lot of ways. Only instead of a pen, I use a Canon XA40, which is actually harder to write a poem about. Not saying I'm better than him, obviously, of course, that's not for me to say. That's for you to say in the comments or on television if possible. But the point is, I shouldn't feel guilty. Times simply changed. Yes, my grandfather knew how to make a chair, but he never learned how to make venom hit the gritty. My dad shouldn't feel bad about not building his own house just because that's what his father did. Should I feel bad that instead of cutting turf in a bog somewhere, I was browsing Alien posters while wearing a G-Shock watch? No, of course not. I should feel great about it. And I do. Look at me go. Yes, man!